Shop the Sherwin-Williams 4th of July sale and get 30% off paints and stains June 26th through July 6th. Whether you're refreshing your interior or exterior, we've got the colors to bring your vision to life. And with delivery, getting everything to your door is easier than ever. Shop online to have it delivered or visit your neighborhood Sherwin-Williams store. Click the banner to learn more. Retail sales only. Some exclusions apply. See store for details. Delivery available on qualifying orders.
I'm here on the job site with Dale, who's a framing contractor.
Hey, good morning.
Dale traded up to Geico Commercial Auto Insurance for all his business vehicles. We're here where he needs us most.
Yep, they sure are.
We make it easy for him to save on all his insurance needs, all in one place, with coverage that fits his business and bottom line. Oh, I shouldn't have looked down.
It's all right.
We're so far up here.
Look at me. Take a deep breath.
No, I'm good. So good.
Get a commercial auto insurance quote today at geico.com and see how much you could save. It feels good to Geico.
Yay Networks.
When we think about limiting the ultra-processed foods in our diet, it's easy to go to the typical, the cookies, cakes, chips, the savory and sweet prepackaged snacks. We're often not really fully aware, though, of just how much of our diets are centered on ultra-processed foods, even these options that we think are truly nourishing. We are going out of our way to choose these foods for specific qualities they're giving us, whether it's protein or it might be plant-based meat alternatives. But at the end of the day, a lot of these foods still fall under that ultra-processed category. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily a bad thing or that we need to eliminate them. We just need to be mindful of what they're giving us and, just as important, what they're not giving us. A quick note before we dive into today's podcast. If you like what you hear, I would love for you to subscribe to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, wherever you download your podcast. It would also be incredible if you take a minute to rate and review this podcast. Those things do matter and they really help us. I'm Molly Kimball. Welcome to Fueled, a wellness and nutrition podcast. I'm a registered dietitian and nutrition journalist with a passion to help people live their strongest, healthiest life possible. In my weekly TV segments and columns, there's a limited amount of time and space to cover everything, but there's so much more to share. This podcast is my opportunity to dive deeper into the topics you want to know about. In this week's episode of Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, we are talking about ultra-processed foods. And before we get into that, I kind of want to reframe a little bit of what we're thinking about when we think ultra-processed foods. Overall and largely, what we're going to be talking about is going to be related to those foods that are, you open the package and it is ready for us to just dive into. So think Doritos, Skittles, cookies, cakes, candies, chips, the savory snacks, the prepackaged things, fast food, these foods that are so far removed from their natural state. They are so far removed from what those foods look like when they were grown or harvested or raised. Between then and when they actually reach our plate, very, very little, if no resemblance. I mean, think about like a Skittle. There's what ingredient is even in Skittles that actually ever really did exist in nature. They're just truly ultra processed. So that's largely going to be what we're going to be talking about when we think ultra processed foods. But I don't want you to think that you're completely off the hook if you don't typically consume those types of foods. Many of the things that we reach for when we're looking for how we're going to fuel our bodies as best we can. And I know if you're listening to this podcast, you're proactively seeking wellness information, nutrition information. How can you better your mind, your body, your spirit with these lifestyle choices? And so making that strong assumption that if you're listening to this podcast, you're already making these nourishing choices as best you can or have access to, have the knowledge to. So there's a lot of things though that we might be reaching for, and they're still fine. They're still good to incorporate into our diet. And they're also ultra processed. So some examples might be protein bars, protein powders, a lot of the plant-based meat substitutes, things like Impossible or Beyond. All of those things, or we should say most of those things, look very different in the state that we're consuming them than how their natural state. They've gone through many, many, many processing steps. We'll get into like why that's not good in just a bit, but just to kind of paint that picture a little bit so that we're not just thinking, oh, I don't eat a lot of cookies, cake, ice cream, prepackaged snacks that we would think of air quote junk food. But do we have these other things? And that's not to say that that protein powder doesn't have a really good place in our diets. That plant-based protein powder that's, natural plant-based sweeteners, nothing artificial, that can be a fantastic addition to that smoothie that also has those real whole foods. But that still means that that protein powder is still processed, or what we would consider ultra processed. So there's not a set definition for foods that are what this means to be ultra processed. But loosely, if you would say, how many different steps or stages has this gone through? And most foods in the grocery store, unless we're buying it in the produce section, the meat or seafood department, or the bulk bins of dried foods, most things that we're purchasing have been processed to some degree. So if you think about oats, oats have been at least processed to some degree. What is in that container, even steel cut oats, isn't exactly like the oats as they were harvested. Same thing with almond milk. If you're getting unsweetened almond milk, it's still processed. It's still processed from the state of when it was almonds. So realizing that even a lot of these things that we think of, cheese is even processed minimally. Those things that I mentioned, though, things like oats or unsweetened almond milk or cheese, these are processed minimally. So and then things that are really processed very minimally would be something like frozen blueberries or almond flour or almond butter, things that have been, almond butter would have just been blended, ground, blended, maybe a little bit of oil, maybe a little bit of salt added. So those are going to be minimally processed. So realizing that almost everything has gone through some level of processing. So that in itself is not bad. But how far removed is it from its natural state? And those are the types of foods that we'll be talking about when we look at what are some of the drawbacks and the pitfalls of having these. So here's why it matters, and here's why even having this conversation matters. It's estimated that about 60% of our diet, of the typical American diet, is made up of ultra-processed foods. And let's be honest, we're not talking about, in that statement, we're not talking about the plant-based meat alternatives, and we're not talking about protein bars and protein powders. When we're talking about the typical American diet contains about an estimated 60% of ultra-processed foods. That's the cookies, cakes, ice cream, fast food, those chips, these prepackaged, really convenient items. And so that's what we're talking about when we look at ultra-processed foods. And that is the category of foods that we really want to try to dial back when possible. And the reason, when we look at why, and we look at, well, what does research show us about these foods? What's the trend when we do have a high intake of these ultra-processed foods, especially these ultra-processed foods that are some of the typical options that we just talked about? Number one, more likely to have cardiovascular disease, specifically things like heart attack or stroke. There was a study, a group of NYU researchers, they studied about 3,000 people, and they found that just one additional serving for every additional serving of ultra-processed foods in a day, there was an additional 7% increased risk in cardiovascular disease. That's a lot. That's fast. That adds up. And when you think about how much is someone having, how much is someone consuming in a day, other research supports this. So looking at those ultra-processed foods raise cholesterol, they raise triglycerides, they're linked to high blood pressure, inflammatory bowel disease, certain types of cancer, and obesity. That's another really big issue with these foods is when they are ultra-processed, what does that mean? They're often very low in fiber. They're very low in nutrients, vitamins, minerals, and a lot of times it's also what's been added to them. Hydrogenated oils, added sugars, artificial flavors, food dyes, artificial food dyes, emulsifiers, stabilizers, all types of stuff is added in there the more processed that it is. So we're looking at things that not only have a high level of added sugar, added saturated fat or trans fats, added salt, but they're also lacking those vitamins, minerals, and that fiber. And when we're looking at the foods that keep us feeling fuller longer, it would be fiber and protein and fats. These, especially looking to get plant-based fats in there, those are the foods that are really going to sustain us. And there's been study after study that shows when people have access to unlimited foods and they're able to consume foods just at will. There's not a set amount that the researchers are giving them. They can just consume. When those foods are ultra processed, they're going to consume more, and they're going to go back for more, and they're going to go back more often for those ultra processed foods. So when we look at all those drawbacks of ultra processed foods, including obesity being in there, it's no surprise because those foods aren't very satiating. They're not very satisfying. They don't keep us very full for long. And because they typically are high in salt and fat and carbs, they're lighting up those receptors in our brain, those pleasure centers that get us going back for more. They up the craving. They're what can make us feel like we're addicted to these, that we just can't stop. And we want more and more and more of these foods. So all of those things are tied in with many of these typical ultra-processed foods that we would find in like a typical American diet. So it's really easy for us to, I think, conceptualize what's in the ultra-processed foods that isn't great. The ingredients that are added in there, like we said, the added sugars, the hydrogenated oils, the artificial colors, artificial food dyes. But it's something that we don't often think about is what's not in there. So when we're looking at those real whole foods, things like vegetables, fruits, nuts, seeds, beans, whole grains, we're not talking fancy foods. We're just talking real whole foods. These have so many different nutrients that we're not getting. We could take, expensive vitamins. We can take all these different supplements. We could drink protein drinks that are fortified with XYZ. We could eat protein bars that are fortified with these different nutrients. But when we're having those real whole foods, the vegetables, the fruits, the nuts, the seeds, the beans, the whole grains, there's so many nutrients, the antioxidants, the phytochemicals that we're not going to get from those ultra-processed foods, even those that are a little bit that are better for us, like the protein drinks or protein bars like we were talking about. They're also going to have things like the omega-3 fats. They're going to have slow digesting fiber. They're going to have the vitamins, the minerals, all of this. And they're not going to have those refined starches, sugars, salt, etc. So looking at the more ultra-processed foods we have in our diet, essentially the easiest way to say it is it's edging out that good stuff. As we're edging out that good stuff that we're talking about too, it impacts our gut health. If you remember, there was a podcast we did a while back, Dr. Timothy Spector, I'll link to it in the show notes. And we talked about gut microbiome. We had 2 separate podcasts actually with Dr. Spector. Really incredible information. When we talk about our gut microbiome and essentially the impact this has on health that we can't even, it's hard to even comprehend how relevant and impactful gut microbiome is, because it's not just when we think about our gut health or our gastrointestinal system or our, if someone has IBS, it's way beyond that. It can affect our joint pain. It can affect migraines. It can affect our mood. There's so much that goes into that gut microbiome is linked to. And the more that we're consuming these ultra processed foods, even those that are marketed and might truly be better for us, the more we're consuming these ultra processed foods and the less we're consuming those real whole foods, we're actually specifically choosing foods that are having a negative impact on our gut microbiome. One of the big takeaways from Dr. Spector was to aim for, at least 20, ideally 20, 25, even 30 different species of plants a day. And that might seem like a lot, but if you look at guacamole, you might have, 4 or 5 different types of plants in guacamole. They're the ingredients used to make it up. Well, the more that we do these ultra processed foods, the less that we're having these true whole foods that are just so critical to gut health. Also, when we're looking at what we're not getting once we have these ultra processed foods, I mentioned the plant-based meat substitutes earlier. And, if someone is avoiding meat or they're looking to do a more plant-focused diet, it can be really appealing to do something like Impossible Burger or Beyond or any of the different, those are 2 like really popular that, a lot of people have been talking about lately. They've been marketed lately, but there's so many different brands of plant-based meat alternatives in our freezer section. You'll see some in the refrigerated or even produce section. And some of these meat replacers, especially something like Impossible or Beyond, part of what makes them different than a lot of these others is that they mimic, they have a very similar high protein and low carb ratio, similar to meat. A lot of the meat alternatives, it may be a breaded chicken alternative or whatever it might be, veggie burgers. And while they may have protein, a lot of times they still have a good bit of carbs and often even more carbs than they do protein. What's interesting about the Impossible or the Beyond and what makes it different is that these, like meat, are high protein, they're low in carbs. But when we look at what's actually in there beyond that, there's an interesting review. It was a group from Duke University, and they took a closer look at the nutritional profile of these types of foods. And here's kind of what it comes down to. So many of the elements of nutrition don't show up on a nutrition facts label. So we get caught up a lot of times in, well, how much carb is in it? How much sodium, right? What's the protein? What's the added sugar? What's the fiber? And all of those things can matter. But there's other elements of nutrition that aren't anywhere on the labels, and it's impossible to really know just how these products compare. So some of the things that you would say, what's in beef that's not listed on the label, that's also good for us. And so beef, of course, high in protein, but beyond that, if someone's saying, I want to limit beef, whether it's for the environment or for animal welfare, they want to limit their animal-based saturated fat. There's actually, and all of those things would be valid reasons, but when we look at, well, what's in beef that can actually be a good thing, we look at creatine, we look at glucosamine. There's actually the omega-3 fatty acid DHA in beef. And so when we look at these nutrients have really important physiological, anti-inflammatory, immunomodulatory roles. And all of that means that they are important for our brain. They're important for our muscles. They're important for whole body wellness. Let's take a minute to talk about Daily Harvest, one of our partners for this week's episode. So just as we've been talking about, we want to have nourishing, wholesome dinners on hand. But at the end of what might feel like a long day, cooking dinner from scratch, it can be the last thing that we feel like doing, or it can be the last thing that we feel like we have the time for. And of course, if the fridge is empty, it's easy to take the easy route with takeout or with some of these ultra-processed foods that we've been talking about. With Daily Harvest, though, we don't have that temptation. Daily Harvest helps to keep our freezers fully stocked with wholesome options that are delivered right to our door, delicious, nourishing, and ready in minutes. Daily Harvest, they offer harvest bowls, soups, flatbreads, snacks, smoothies, lattes, all built on organic fruits and vegetables. Their smoothies make it really easy to keep things interesting, mixing it up, and their bowls truly taste homemade. Daily Harvest creates foods that are both good for our health and the health of the planet by supporting farmers who invest in practices that increase biodiversity and improve the health of our soil, and delivering in compost-friendly packaging. New on the scene is their delicious Harvest Bakes. They are ready-to-bake, vegetable-packed dishes that are sizzling with gourmet-level flavors. So avoid the takeout temptation and get Daily Harvest. Go to dailyharvest.com/fueled to get up to $40 off your first box. That's dailyharvest.com/fueled for up to $40 off your first box. dailyharvest.com/fueled. On the flip side, some of these plant-based meat alternatives have different types of, phytochemicals, antioxidants that are in them that's not found in beef. So it's not to say that one is always going to be better than the other, but they do not contain the whole nutrients, the whole profile of what is inside of beef. You're not going to find in plant-based, and then vice versa. One of the most striking examples that I experienced that really kind of opened my eyes to, wow, there's so much in foods that are not on a label, that are not even quantifiable. There might be nutrients. I'm sure there's things in nutrients in foods and compounds in foods that we don't even know about yet. We don't know yet either that they exist, or we're not sure exactly of what their benefit may be. So when we think that we're getting a good replacement for these things, we think that we're taking either, let's say, a multivitamin supplement, or we're drinking a protein drink that's fortified, or we've got, fill in the blank of what it is that we're getting our nutrients because we're eating XYZ. That's not always going to be the case. And so the most striking example that I experienced was when my mom was in the hospital. She was in the hospital for right at a year. She was in the ICU, intubated, after a really big procedure she had and lots of complications. And she was intubated for months, and she couldn't pass the swallow study. It was devastating, and she was going downhill. And she was, we ended up doing PEG tube feeding. So where it was, if you think about like a prepared, almost like a fortified drink, it would, a lot of times it would be like a can type or hanging by a pouch that went straight through into her stomach. And you could accomplish the same thing. She couldn't swallow, so we did the PEG tube that went straight to her stomach. But if someone was able to swallow, in theory, they would say, well, I'm not able to eat, but I'm having these different drinks. A lot of times, some of the popular brands you may see would be like Ensure or Boost or any of these kind of supplemental nutrition, liquid nutrition that would be either through a tube or someone could drink, or either any of those options. What we saw though was that through that time that she was on the tube feed and wasn't able to pass that swallow test, was either intubated or just kept failing that swallow study. I mean, her hair was falling out like crazy. Every time we went in, there's more and more hair all over the pillow, which, okay, that was the least of the concerns with everything. If you're in the hospital for a year, that's the least of the concerns you've got. But what was really devastating was the wounds that she had that were not healing. And there would be, on the back of her head from, the being intubated, the stuff that's around your head and holds that. Well, that rubs, and that was forming wounds, sores that weren't healing, and bed sores on her back that were not healing and got really, really just horribly painful, just really dangerous. And it was like, what do we do? We were doing everything, all these treatments to these wounds on her, and they weren't healing. It was the craziest thing. She finally went through a procedure, which, by the way, was actually, she couldn't swallow because there was, her vocal cords weren't striking against each other. If you imagine like your two fingers together and you would kind of brush your two fingers together, that's how your vocal cords, they kind of hit each other and touch as you swallow. Hers were separated and apart, almost like a V, and they weren't coming together as she swallowed. So they actually injected a filler. If you imagine like filler, like someone would get in their face, it was that type of a filler in her vocal cords. So it plumped them up. So they would rub together. When she swallowed, they would touch, and it would protect so she wouldn't aspirate. It would actually help her to swallow properly. And that was a game changer. And then she actually never had to have it done again, because then she was able to swallow, get those muscles back working, strengthen them, and she never had to have it happen again. So side note, if anybody's listening and you've got someone in a situation where they're continuing to fail the swallow study, we had a speech therapist who truly saved her life by identifying that was what the issue was. We were able to have that procedure done, and then she was able to swallow. All of that is to say, I was so excited. Y'all know I'm like the dietitian. I'm like, okay, I'm going to bring, she loves the salmon. She loved like salmon and sweet potatoes. And there was an Outback right by the hospital. I was like, I'm going to get her this meal. Like, this is going to be the greatest thing ever. And she was loosely interested in it. But what she really liked was the hospital food that was meatballs, spaghetti, white spaghetti, maybe not even a bunch of meatballs, more like red sauce and white spaghetti, lemon icebox pie. I mean, she was all over that. And I was devastated because I'm like, she's finally able to eat, and she's finally able to get these nutrients, and she's eating lemon icebox pie and like the dinner rolls and the, red sauce marinara over white noodles. And I was like really frustrated. And then within, a week, I noticed that the hair wasn't on her pillow anymore. That was the first sign. And I'm like, that's interesting. Like, it was, her hair stopped falling out. And then those wounds actually started healing, like forming new skin and healing. And it was like, wow, she's not even eating the quality of food that I sure wish she was, but she's eating real food. And while in theory, those tube feeds, anything that's vitamin fortified kind of liquid nutrition, in theory, it's given at least, more than 100% or whatever times of the daily value or the RDA that we would need of these nutrients. On paper, those nutrients were met, but there was still so much in real food, and not even the best quality real food, that was a game changer for her. So all of that is to say, when we're looking at what's in real food and why we want to avoid ultra processed, that's why, and that's a very extreme example. And I hope it was interesting, or at least somewhat relevant to paint that picture. But for me, that was like just a real game changer. That's not going to be, hopefully, the picture for many of us. And I hope most of us don't have to experience anything like that with ourselves or with people that we're close with. Paint that same picture, though, for the person who exists or subsists off of protein drinks, protein powders, protein bars. How many? I mean, I've had, clients who would say, oh my gosh, I really love that protein bar. And they want to have it for breakfast. They want to have another one for their lunch, another one for their snack. No, we can't do that. We can't have more wrappers from products like that than we have real food happening. So while that was an extreme example, it doesn't have to be a liquid nutrition through a tube feed. It could be protein bars, protein powders, these things that are kind of processed. So again, thinking, okay, it's not just what might be in these foods that isn't good for us, but it's also what is it edging out. So ultimately, what does this mean? What do we want to try to do to minimize our intake of these ultra-processed foods? For starters, assessing what you're taking in that is highly processed. That doesn't mean we have to cut it out. I love so many different plant-based protein powders. They can be a really good addition to foods. There's a lot of ready-to-drink protein shakes that are fantastic. And if that's what you love to make your iced coffee with, I love that. It's given us a lot of what you might get in milk, plus maybe some more nutrients, more protein or whatever that might be. So there can definitely be a place for the plant-based meat alternatives, for protein bars, protein powders, a lot of these foods that would still be considered ultra-processed. So we're not saying we have to remove all these, but just be aware that they are. And then making sure that what we're surrounding it with is as close to the real form, the original form as possible. That does not mean we have to go to the farmer's market or shop organic or go to a Whole Foods type store every day. Was that fine? We love the farmer's market. We love supporting local. We love doing, as nourishing as possible. But don't put that barrier up thinking that it must be that in order to truly be good for us. So while we love fresh, whole, unprocessed vegetables and fruits, it's also okay if we did the frozen version of that. If you did frozen berries, no sugar added. If you did frozen spinach, the frozen chopped spinach can be fantastic. Those products are frozen, they're flash frozen right when harvested, so they're really retaining a lot of the nutrients. So frozen vegetables, frozen fruits with no sugar added, no salt added are going to be really great options. Things that, and they're also not super expensive and you don't have any waste on those. Also things like nuts, seeds, nut butters, beans, legumes, lentils. Those are things that we can buy dried and cook them. But that's one where even if you said, okay, I'm going to do canned, and because, it's easier for me to do canned and maybe do the canned low sodium variety, you still have that bean in the original form. It hasn't been processed or changed or unrecognizable. It has been processed that it is in the can, but it's not so far removed from its natural state. So even if you were going to say, okay, I'm going to do canned black beans or canned red beans, of course we love, like Blue Runner has the no salt added Creole style red beans. There's so much that we can do that can still make it easy for us. And of course, things like milk, cottage cheese, the unsweetened almond milk or coconut milk, Greek yogurt, eggs, all of these are things that we don't have to spend a lot of money. It doesn't have to be super fancy, but how are we going to layer this in? So if that protein drink is something that you love, keep it. But let's also add in whatever the fruits might be, or adding some vegetables into that smoothie or whatever it may be. Looking at the ingredient list to see what's in there. How can we keep it as short as possible? So if we're looking at, let's say chips, for example, Beanfields Chip is a brand that is primarily black beans. There's black beans or there's white beans. Those are the key ingredients in these chips. And it's the first among the ingredients. So looking for ingredient lists that are short and they have recognizable names, but also that food is that real food ingredient. But it would be a way to have chips that are also still some degree of nourishment to them. And the reality is these foods almost always are going to take a bit more time, even if you're doing something that's like a step towards being more processed. Let's say spiralized butternut squash or spiralized zucchini or cauliflower rice, and you're buying it already done. Those are they're giant time savers because you're not spiralizing the zucchini or butternut squash or spaghetti squash or making using the food processor for the cauliflower to make cauliflower rice. Those steps are already done. They're kind of the one step from ready type of approach. You're still going to be spending a little more time preparing those than you are if you did a total kind of a TV dinner, frozen dinner type of approach. Those have come a long way too, though, I'll say. And even at Walmart, I'm seeing different brands of frozen dinners that when you look at it, there's a couple of brands that actually show you the food through the window versus the cardboard label on the outside that paints a pretty picture or what maybe they think is pretty of what that dish looks like. Instead, the packaging is open, and so you're able to see what's inside of that vacuum pack, and you can see the whole florets of broccoli, the whole chicken. So even those types of things can be a way to, just maybe slow down a bit next time you're at the store and see, instead of grabbing that first option that you're usually grabbing, instead of maybe the canned soup that is, really, I hope nobody's really relying on chicken noodle soup or ramen noodle type soup, but using that as an example versus canned split pea soup. Yeah, it's more processed, but it's still a lot closer to natural state than something like the chicken noodle soup. So looking and just kind of slowing down a little bit and seeing what are some things that you can, take inventory of what you're consuming, what's on the regular rotation in your pantry, in your fridge. Is there something that can be a relatively easy step to swap it out to give you something that would give you that less processed, more wholesome option? A lot of times the processed foods are going to happen with breakfast because we want something fast getting out the door. It might be snacks that we're taking along with us. So that might be, again, fully acknowledging that it's going to take a bit more time. It might be having these foods at home that are going to be that real food snack and divvying it up and putting it in a little glass container with a lid that you can take with you. Using things like ball jars or kind of reusable. There's really good kind of snap lid style Tupperwares. And I especially like the ones that are glass, especially if you're going to be heating in it. So it's going to be, when I leave, I love like a snack being an almond flour tortilla with some cheese melted on it, like a little fold over quesadilla. It can just be a fast grab and go snack. I also love cottage cheese, and I'll buy it a lot of times in the single serve cartons because, again, easier for me to take that and go. Having that with berries or having that with like the savory whole grain cracker or chip can be really good in there. I like that. But those are things that they're not just pre-packaged that I'm going to keep at work or in my car that I can just rip open that package and go. They're going to be things that I'm going to have to think ahead and bring. So ultimately, it comes down to taking that quick inventory, assessing what are we currently having, how much of it is ultra processed that still these foods can be really good for us and they can still have a place, and how much is ultra processed that it's really not offering us much nutritionally. And what are some other alternatives that you can keep that might take a little bit more time, maybe 1 or 2 extra steps in preparing, but can you do that? And then make that ahead, put that in those containers, have it with you. That's where something like, doing a day or two at a time, or 2 or 3 days at a time can work. You keep that in your fridge and you just grab it on the way out. A breakfast that can work really well is making like egg muffins. So eggs, cheese, some vegetables, kind of baking that into little muffin tins, and you can freeze those. Or make a couple of days worth, put it in the fridge and grab those as you're going on the way out. It's something that is super fast. It takes that time to prepare it, but then you don't have to take a lot of time day of each time that you're having it. So just kind of thinking through what are some ways to add more real whole and doesn't have to just be fruits and vegetables. We're also talking eggs, fish, real food, and working that into those snacks, working that into the meals versus that package that we just open so quickly, even if it is nourishing or what we're considering to be healthy, like a protein bar or fill in the blank. So a quick rapid fire of a couple more ideas here. So instead of the, typical yogurt that's artificially flavored, sugar sweetened, go with the plain. Y'all know I love the Fage, the Greek, low fat but not fat free plain yogurt, and add your own flavors to it. Add your own fruit. You can make it savory or sweet, but I love savory with little cherry tomatoes and basil and a drizzle of balsamic vinegar or balsamic reduction. Or you can do it with fruit nuts, kind of make your own little granola style on there. Things like instead of the, prepackaged peanut butter crackers or cheese crackers, make your own. Get real good quality crackers. We love Triscuit Thins, or a gluten-free option is the Crunch Master crackers. They have them at like Walmart, Sam's, all kinds of grocery stores. But real quality whole grain crackers, put almond butter, peanut butter on there, put cheese on there. Make your own versions of that. Or you don't have to do it on crackers. You could have that same thing with, apple slices or celery or carrots or whatever, but making your own little snack packs. Again, that's something that, depending on what it is, you can make a few ahead of time. And I think an obvious, of course, people, you would know, like, okay, instead of white bread, do whole grain bread or like a sprouted whole grain bread. But, a lot of people are trying these different low carb brands now. And there's a lot of brands of low carb bread that are really just, processed starches and added fibers, and they're really not, they're the furthest thing from natural possible. So like if you've seen, there's a brand called Sola bread that I've gotten a lot of questions about. And if you look at that, the ingredients are like literally wheat gluten, oil, wheat starch, wheat protein, defatted soy flour. It's just strange things cobbled together to make a low carb bread. But then there's a bread that's in the freezer section called Base Culture. It's fantastic. It's eggs, it's cashew butter, it's flaxseed. So it's eggs, it's almond butter, it's flaxseed, almond flour, apple cider vinegar. So, two things that seem on the surface very similar, low carb breads. Turning it over and looking to see those are real foods that we just said that's in that Base Culture bread versus the kind of Frankenfood approach that's in Sola bread. So that's what I mean when I say just kind of slowing down. What are you buying? Is there something else similar that could have better quality ingredients? And that gluten-free bread is just, I think, a really easy example of two things that may on first glance, that nutrition label and the numbers might look similar in terms of calories, net carbs, etc., but the quality of ingredients is vastly different. So slowing down, taking that time, looking at labels, not just for the nutrition facts, but especially for the ingredients, and then seeing, are there other things that, like I said, they may take a little bit more time, but ultimately, if you divvy them up, you put them in some of those little glass containers, a little snap-on lid, and you've got it with you, it might also help save money in the long run by kind of planning out and pre-preparing these. So I want to hear your ideas, some of your tips, your strategies, what has worked for you in this, and maybe some of the foods that you've been consuming that have been ultra processed that you weren't even realizing it. And you're like, wow, holy cow. Like you didn't realize that, some of the things that we think we're doing really, really well, and maybe we're not. So I want to hear about all those. You can always reach out and email me through my website, mollykimball.com. And I am registered dietitian Molly Kimball, and you've been listening to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, the podcast. And if you would like more Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, please head over to mollykimball.com, and you can follow me, Molly Kimball RD, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you haven't yet, please go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Join us next week for another dose of Fueled Wellness and Nutrition. Thanks for listening, and stay focused on living your strongest, healthiest life.